First, a big development in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The US has increased pressure on Israel to end its bombardment of Palestinian militants in Gaza. Joe Biden has told Benjamin Netanyahu that he expects a significant de-escalation today and a path to a ceasefire. Well, we're waiting to see how that plays out. Both Palestinians and Israelis say a ceasefire isn't on the table, and so the blame game continues. Here's Israel's Prime Minister.
We try to target those who target us with great precision. That is not as surgical an operation as it is. Even in a surgical room in a hospital, you don't have the ability to prevent collateral damage around affected tissues. Even then you can't. And certainly in a military operation you cannot. But there is no army in the world that does more than the Israeli army, in the Israeli security services, in Israeli intelligence, to prevent collateral damage. To have Israel criticized for that is absurd.
And here's Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who governs the occupied West Bank.
What the occupation is doing in Gaza, including vicious attacks on civilians, deliberate shelling of residential areas, destruction of infrastructure, as well as the killing of women, the elderly and children, is organised state terrorism carried out by the Israeli occupation and war crimes punishable by international law. We won't spare any efforts to bring those responsible in front of international courts.
So no let-up in the rhetoric. Israeli defence sources told the BBC their operation against Hamas will continue at full throttle. New Israeli airstrikes have hit Gaza. Here's some of the damage. Among the targets, a network of tunnels Israel says is controlled by Hamas, and it's shelling targets beyond its borders into Lebanon. After 4 rockets were fired from the country into Israel, one of them was intercepted by the Israeli Iron Dome defence system. The rest fell in open areas. Meanwhile, militants in Gaza fired another barrage of rockets into Israel. Several are said to have hit Ashdod and Ashkelon, though no casualties have been recorded. 12 people in Israel have died so far, and over 200 Palestinians. The BBC's Rushdie Abu Alof is in Gaza with the latest.
Last night was intensified, especially in Khan Yunis, which is the second biggest city in Gaza, where about 70 airstrikes were targeting roads, infrastructure for the militants group Hamas and other military groups. Also, some of the houses were hit. The overnight raids caused four people killed, including 2 militants, and Hamas says that one of the journalists who works for Al-Aqsa TV, the Hamas-run TV, was also killed in the strikes. Israel said they hit Hamas hard. They managed to kill many commanders from it. One of the commanders was a senior commander who's responsible for the Gaza Strip in Al-Qassam brigades that was killed in the beginning of the operation. Also yesterday, Islamic Jihad was targeted, and a senior commander in the northern Gaza was also killed. We noticed in the last couple of days, since Sunday, when the 42 people killed, that less Israeli fire and more or less frequent rockets has been sent to Israel from Gaza.
Well, the conflict is having a huge toll on children on both sides. 2 have died in Israel, while Gaza's health ministry says 63 children have died there. This is 9-year-old Yara, who died in an Israeli airstrike last Sunday in Gaza City. Her younger sister Rula, who was 5, was also killed in the same attack alongside other relatives. Well, 11 children who've died had been participating in a programme aimed at helping them deal with trauma run by the Norwegian Refugee Council, and this is its Secretary General, Jan Egeland.
They had nightmares. We were treating them and we had progress. So many of them were now doing good in school, coming out of the trauma, and then they were killed. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is not correct when he just said this is so precise and is so surgical and whatnot. This is killing children. There are 5 to 6 times as many dead Palestinian children as the total number of fatalities, military and civilian, combined on the Israeli side.
Well, next we want to look at Gaza's infrastructure. According to the UN, over 156 buildings have been destroyed, 6 hospitals and 11 primary healthcare centres damaged. One hospital isn't functioning because of a lack of electricity. Over 50,000 people are displaced. Many of them are here at UN schools, which have been transformed into makeshift shelters. This is one in northern Gaza. Well, Najla Shawa is a humanitarian worker in Gaza. This is her experience.
There are no shelters in Gaza. People need to understand that. No shelters in Gaza. There are only schools which are just normal, ordinary school above the ground. People are just hiding because they leave their areas that has been targeted, hit already, damaged or destroyed homes, or they are fleeing border areas under direct artillery fire. So 50,000 people are fleeing in schools. Many others, thousands of people, many of them I know of, who are fleeing their homes from within residential areas in the middle of Gaza City, are leaving to other places. Every day we have several hours of complete panic from friends and acquaintances who keep on calling each other. Yes, we need to leave this. Yes, there's a rumor here. Yes, there is a drone rocket here. All of a sudden, a drone rocket to a house in a residential area. Everybody leaves the surrounding area, not knowing where to go. Many people don't know where to go. There is no safe place in Gaza.
Well, Gaza is a strip of land bordering Egypt, Israel and the Mediterranean. It's one of the most densely populated areas of the world. 1.9 million people live here. 1.4 million are registered as refugees, although that figure is likely to be higher now. Well, they live on 360 square kilometres of land, an area that's poorer and smaller than the West Bank. We've talked about the impact now on children and infrastructure. We're also told that Gaza's only COVID-19 lab can't now conduct tests because an airstrike hit near the health ministry. Well, Dr. Natalie Thurtle is with Doctors Without Borders in Jerusalem. These are her concerns.
So Gaza was near the end of its second wave, but not at the end. So they still were having 300 or so cases per day for a population of 2 million when this escalation started. And they still had 20 or so patients in ICU with COVID. And given their limited ICU capacity of around 100 beds, that's a significant contribution to their ICU needs going into this crisis. Now that there's no testing capacity and you've got 58,000 internally displaced people who are primarily congregating in UNRWA schools and places to try and achieve shelter, the risk of an escalation in a third wave of coronavirus is really, really serious. MSF's got over 200 staff in Gaza. Honestly, it's quite confronting speaking to them on a daily basis. They are frightened, their children are frightened, they're hiding in the basement every night. They are genuinely scared for their lives every day. They've lost family members, they've lost their homes. It's really challenging for people on the ground to even think about working, and they are working. You know, they're struggling and continuing, and they're incredibly resilient.
So that's the situation in Gaza. In the past 10 days, Hamas has fired more than 3,400 rockets into Israeli cities, killing 12 people. Sarit is a student in southern Israel near the Gaza Strip. She told the BBC the trauma it's causing.
Living in a community that's full of people, and I can say, unfortunately, that a lot of people left the community just to take a bit of a break, some air, mostly the families with kids. They took their kids so their kids can actually sleep also at night. I personally am a student right nearby in Sderot, a city that's been being bombed also, has been bombed. And I haven't been to college for also 10 days. So I haven't been studying either. I'm sitting at home, pretty much watching the news, hearing bombings, running to the shelter. But I think I, like most of our country, really believe that this is what we have to do in order to get quiet to the south and to our citizens.
Well, reports in Israeli media suggest that the country's security cabinet will assess the possibility of a ceasefire at its next meeting. Meanwhile, a Hamas leader says efforts by mediators are serious and continuous, but that Palestinian demands had to be met. Well, more now from our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who's in Jerusalem.
This morning, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to foreign ambassadors here and said he did not have a stopwatch in his hand. You couldn't put a time frame on this. He said that the operations against Hamas were continuing. And after the White House statement was released, Mr. Netanyahu also released a statement saying, "I'm determined to continue this operation until its goal is achieved." Now, of course, that raises the question of what is the goal? And that essentially is the destruction of as much Hamas infrastructure as possible, and guarantees that Israeli civilians are going to have a prolonged period of calm after this is all over. And by prolonged, I mean years. That is what Israel expects from this. We don't know what Hamas is prepared to offer so far.
Well, last night we heard from a Palestinian activist and campaign director with the global Palestinian organisation Abbas. And tonight we're speaking to Lahav, Harkov, diplomatic correspondent and senior contributing editor for the Jerusalem Post. Thanks so much for coming on the programme.
Thanks for having me on.
So how close do you think we are to a ceasefire right now?
I actually do think we're pretty close, probably not tomorrow morning, but in the coming few days. Partly because, there is pressure from Israel's key ally, the United States, and partly because things do seem to be slowing down. Hamas is shooting rockets into Israel literally as we speak. I see the notifications going across my phone, but there is somewhat of a slowdown. Israel is not looking to prolong this forever. I think, there's a specific, the army uses the terminology, they have a bank of targets. So there are a number of targets that they want to hit in order to feel that Hamas will be sufficiently deterred for the coming years. And then, just
to jump in on exactly that point, this is a military strategy here. They have a number of points they want to hit, and then you think they will consider a ceasefire.
Yes, that's at least what Israel's officials, both top government officials and military officials, are saying.
And given that Joe Biden's, the pressure, and you mentioned the influence there, the statement stronger today than we've had in the past, some saying those statements could have come sooner. What do you make of that?
I think the statements could have come sooner, but I think that they didn't because Joe Biden truly supports Israel's right to defend itself. Biden calls himself a Zionist. He believes that Israel not only has a right to exist, but must and should exist to defend the Jewish people. And if Israel can't defend itself, then Israel can't do that job. So I think that Biden is with Israel on this, but, wants to make sure that this isn't prolonged. And that there isn't unnecessary deaths, etc.
And Lahav, can I just ask you about the internal politics in Israel? Before this conflict started, Netanyahu was struggling with a position of authority. How's his position now?
Look, I've not seen the new sort of election-style polls conducted in these past 10 days. I think that Israelis do have a bit of a rallying around the flag effect when there's a conflict like this. But Netanyahu, of course, is not the flag. And his support had been slipping before, as you've mentioned. He wasn't able to build a governing coalition, even though Likud was the largest party in our election that took place just a couple of months ago. I don't see him being able to form a coalition after this. I think moving forward, the most likely scenario is that we'll have another election, which will be the fifth in less than 2 years. So it's a difficult political time in Israel.
OK, Lahav, Harkov, great to have you on. Thank you so much. The US is one of Israel's strongest allies, and while Joe Biden has expressed support for a ceasefire, up until now he hadn't demanded one. And that's put him at odds with some Democrats. One of his biggest critics on the issue is Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. They came face to face on Tuesday. This was the moment. Well, this was in Michigan. The two spent 8 minutes in what looked like an intense debate. Ms. Tlaib has family in the West Bank and has been blunt in calling on Mr. Biden to do more to support Palestinians. According to the New York Times, she told the president during that 8 minutes that the status quo was enabling more killing and his policy of supporting Mr. Netanyahu wasn't working. While later, Joe Biden visited a Ford factory in Michigan where he tested an electric vehicle. I'm telling you this because it was during that test drive that he was asked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is how it played out.
Mr. President, can I ask you a quick question on Israel before you drive away?
No, you can't. Not unless you get in front of the car as I step on it. I'm only teasing. Okay, here we go. You ready?
See it, sir.
So he doesn't answer and accelerates away. Well, President Biden insists Israel has a right to defend itself. Critical of that rhetoric, though, is John Dugard, a former United Nations Special Rapporteur to the UNHCR.
There's the evidence provided by the failure of the United States to support a resolution at this stage. But secondly, there's the fact that the United States continues to operate its embassy from Jerusalem, which is contrary to international law. And also there's the fact that the United States pays military aid or tribute to Israel in the form of $3.8 billion a year. So the United States has disqualified itself as an honest broker. And this is not a conflict between states. Israel is engaged in a police operation in Gaza, and it is subject to the rules of proportionality. So I think on all counts, Israel must now be seen to be in violation of international law. But to make matters worse, the United States is aiding and abetting the government of Israel in these activities.
But US rhetoric is changing. In their fourth phone call since the crisis began, President Biden says he told Benjamin Netanyahu he expects to see a significant reduction in hostilities today and a path to a ceasefire. Well, it's the most important intervention yet from the White House. Here's Barbara Plett, Usher in Washington.
Still no explicit call for a ceasefire, though, on a path to a ceasefire is what he's saying. So that's fairly mild, really. No criticism either of any Israeli military action. What he has done is linked it to what he called progress in degrading Hamas capabilities. So we know, of course, that the Israelis had a target list of Hamas infrastructure and leaders and weapons that they wanted to hit. And so he is saying, Joe Biden, you've done enough. Well, it looks like you've done enough. And he is suggesting that the Israelis are coming to that view as well, because he says he has talked about progress, as he called it, together with the Israeli prime minister. Now, of course, we know he's been facing a fair bit of criticism for his response so far within his party, from the left wing, but also from some staunch Israel allies, saying that he should be more outspoken in his calls for an end to the violence and that he should push both sides publicly to end the violence, not just Hamas, which is what he's been doing until now. Also criticism, as you know, from the international community, because the Biden administration has 3 times blocked a statement at the Security Council calling for an end to the violence. And the White House has been arguing that it's more effective to have behind-the-scenes diplomacy. That's the way Joe Biden works, they say, intense behind-the-scenes diplomacy, not publicly calling out Israel. And if the Israelis do respond to this, I think the White House will argue that that approach has been effective. But critics will say that Mr. Biden has been and still is following the Israeli timeline.